James Lees. I'm from Aviation Environment Federation. So we're a national organisation working on the environment and impact of flying. So my question touches on the kind of relation to meeting the climate change commitments and airport expansion. So expanding Heathrow or Gatwick would mean that combined, whether you expand either airport, their emissions would be about, take up around 60% of the available emissions to the aviation sector by 2050, according to the figures the Committee on Climate Change say. So when regional airports are forecast to grow around 200% by that period, could that mean that these forecasts for regional airports can't be met in order to meet the climate change commitment?
It's not possible to answer that question definitively, because it depends on how a future government chose to meet its climate change commitment. What we are doing is operating within a framework set by the Committee on Climate Change, which argued that aviation could expand up to an additional net new runway in the southeast by 2030 and probably an additional one by 2050 within plausible targets for decarbonisation of the economy as a whole. Because as I'm sure many of you know, aviation is not a huge proportion of emissions, carbon emissions at the moment, but if we have an 80% decarbonisation target, then aviation becomes a larger part of emissions, because it is more difficult to decarbonise aviation than it is to decarbonise other emitters of carbon. But as for how, so that's the overall demand framework in which we're operating. But the question of how that would be distributed will depend on, well, one, what policy framework there is, if there's a carbon capped price or if there is a carbon trading scheme, and then it will depend on how the demand is distributed around the country in the light of that cap. And I think it's impossible to say how that would be distributed. But we certainly would reject the idea that you could or should expand massively in the southeast in a way that would imply a huge distribution or a huge expansion of emissions from aviation in the southeast. And that's why we were restrained in saying that we thought one net new runway by 2030 was as much as could be afforded within this carbon emissions framework. But how precisely flights would be distributed within that cap is something which I don't think I could answer.
Steve Balfour, retired air traffic controller. Has the airspace over South East England got the capacity to handle all these extra flights, no matter where you put the new runway? And also, with the forthcoming transfer of ATC service at Gatwick to a German provider, is that likely to have any bearing on the Commission's final decision?
The second point a new one to me. I don't see why it would have an impact on our decision, but I will certainly look at it. That's not something I was familiar with. On the first point, we've been working closely with NATS through this process, and we have been influenced by them in a number of respects. They, for example, gave us some very important advice about the estuary airport and what that would mean for other airports, etc. The advice we've had from them on Heathrow is that, well, and on Gatwick, is that both Heathrow and Gatwick could expand within the net one new runway framework, and that can be managed within the existing airspace management of London. That there would be some implications for Northolt from the Heathrow expansion, obviously, but that those two options could be managed without doing any serious violence to anybody else's airspace. Beyond that, there are some questions. I mean, NATS have said that they think that managing more than 800,000 ATMs from one location in the London airport area would be very, very difficult. We don't have that proposition on the table at this point. That would have been relevant to the estuary, but it wouldn't be relevant to the existing ones. So the short answer is that we do think that the options that we've currently got on the table are manageable in airspace terms, and we have NATS support for that.
Jeffrey Muirhead.
Hi, Howard.
Right. Jeff Muirhead, exit everything.
I think I am actually about exit. Now, it is true to say that one runway will not meet demand in the long run. It's also true to say, as was mentioned earlier, that every time there's a problem currently with weather or other related issues, lots of flights are cancelled in advance. Mostly those flights come out of the regional connections, so the regional service is very much in detriment with the current congestion. You will have current congestion continuing very soon after a new runway is built as well. How are you going to protect resilience so that this issue doesn't reappear after a new runway has been built in the short period of time when that fills up?
Yeah, it is an important question. I mean, in looking at the scheme designs, we have been looking at their resilience planning. I mean, some of that's to do with apron design and taxiways and things like that, because that can help you to some degree. But undoubtedly, the system of operating with very full airports is not ideal. I would say, however, that if you operate within the framework in which airport investment is private sector investment, and there's been, I have to say, in some of the questions and answers with Richard, there was a little bit of, I felt I was a little bit confused at times as to whether we were talking private investment or public investment. But if we're talking private investment, which is is the policy framework within which we're working, we are not likely in London and the South East to have a lot of excess capacity because the private sector will not build that. Why does Frankfurt have 4 runways? They're built by the state of Hesse primarily. And Schiphol is actually essentially publicly owned. And they are able to make strategic decisions and say we will build lots of runways, and if we build them, they will come. Whereas I think that, given the cost, the high cost of building runways in the South East, that you're not likely to get private investors to stand behind them unless they're going to get a high level of utilization out of them, and to get that reasonably quickly. So it's quite difficult to say you can build it but you can't use it fully, because I think you would probably not get that investment. Now, what we will, however, be saying something about in the final report is about how we go from the one net new runway to look at what is needed after that, because we don't think we want to get back into the position we're now in of making decisions far too late. So we will be saying something about the future planning process and when decisions on additional capacity could be made, should be made, by whom they should be made, in order to prevent us getting into this position where our 2 major airports in London and South East are still are heavily constrained at the same time, which I think is really a bad position to be in. So we will be trying to deal with that in the longer term, but I'm not sure we could deal with it by just saying you should have a cap on utilisation of a new bit of kit.
If you do recommend a 3rd runway at Heathrow, many people think a 4th runway will be essential. So would you agree that?
No, I certainly don't think that at all, actually. Well, that's a very big question, because you get into the question of what size of hub do you need. But let me just say, I don't think it's by any means obvious that you would need a 4th runway at Heathrow, or would want a 4th runway at Heathrow. And indeed, in answer to the sorry, I didn't catch your name. The man in the white shirt, or whitish, sort of greeny.
But not sky blue.
Stand up and show them your But you know, there are some significant issues as to whether you would want to or be able to manage an airport, a four-runway airport anywhere in London, the South East actually. And indeed, if you think about the future of different types of capacity, Andrew's presentation, very interesting on that, between low cost and legacy carriers, long haul, etc. You know, it doesn't seem to me very likely, bluntly, that you would want to expand your costly legacy hub to that point. You know, even if it was remotely feasible environmentally or socially, etc. It's not obvious to me that that's the way the market would go at all.
Thank you. Further questions? The gentleman here, and do I have one after that? Anyone over here? Yes, gentleman over the far side. If we can get the microphone to him. You, sir, please.
Paul of London. Am I correct in understanding that your remit includes coming up with some form of political acceptability? And if that is correct, what are you doing to find that political consensus?
I think you're not correct, really. I mean, I don't, you know, there's nothing in our remit that says I must take account of politics. Well, it depends on whether you've got I couldn't detect from your mouth whether it was a capital P or a small p that you were using. But, I mean, I think that what we do need to take seriously into account, and we will be doing over the next few weeks with consultation meetings around the airports where the expansion proposals are, if you mean popular acceptability, you know, is this something that you could get some, you know, acquiescence in? I mean, I'm not naive enough to think that you'll have the whole population around Gatwick going, yeah, you know, that's what we want. But, you know, can you find a solution which mitigates the noise effects for local communities in a way that is, you know, begins to be acceptable to them? So if you mean that kind of thing, yes, I think we do need to look at ways in which an airport expansion could be made acceptable to local communities. If you're talking sort of party politics, you know, hey, I don't think I can do that. I have no idea who's going to be the government anyway. I think the best we can do is to produce a very well-argued report that, you know, covers all of the potential issues that a government would need to address. But I'm not playing a political game.
Do you have a sense of what the government or the powers in Whitehall would like you to recommend?
I very much avoid asking them because I don't want to know what they think.
This public opinion question is quite interesting, isn't it? Because you are, in a sense, on a loser if you're trying to get consensus, because people living around Heathrow don't want it. As Sir Richard Leese eloquently expressed, the millions of people who travel down to Heathrow or Gatwick in order to get their flights would rather have a regional airport. There is no sort of popular consensus about what we should do about this dilemma, is there? To some extent, you're always going to be flying in the face of popular opinion.
Well, you know, there are lots of different polls taken around different airports by different people, which point you in all kinds of different directions, actually. You know, one thing that was very evident when there was a serious possibility that Heathrow would close in favour of an estuary, suddenly quite a lot of people became a bit more keen on Heathrow than they had been before. So it depends on what kind of question you are asking. And of course, some of the things that people say about what they would like are wishes, and that's fine. And you know, but if that's not going to be possible to deliver, then you know you have to say, well, I'm afraid we can't deliver that option. You know, you can't have a flight to everywhere from an airport within 20 miles of your house. That's just not going to happen. So some of the polls, you know, are not really actionable. The more important ones, I think, are, you know, the ones where you try to get at what would be acceptable in terms of, you know, an expansion of an airport. You know, what are the bits that people really dislike? Is it night flights? Is it they want more respite? They want more rotation? You know, we have to accept that airports do exist and they will cause a nuisance to somebody. How do you try to think about what it is you could do to make that airport a better neighbour for the local community?
Thank you. Gentleman over here with the microphone.
Thank you, Sir Howard. John Spooner from the Regional Business Airports Group, an association of airports which handle less than 4 million passengers a year. And it's very encouraging to hear you talk very clearly about the importance of giving these regional airports access to London from the point of view of rebalancing the economy and so on. However, I'm also pleased to be able to say that Heathrow, when we met with them at London Gatwick, have also said, yes, slots should be ring-fenced, we would be pleased to ring-fence them, but then just as you did, they said, maybe legal problems with this, but we promised to look at it. What they didn't do was say, after pointing out possible legal difficulties, that even if it could be done legally, it carries the risk of retaliatory measures from elsewhere. I wonder if you could tell us what you meant by that, and also reassure the smaller airports in the country that these points made by these very, very powerful, well-resourced interests are going to be examined independently by the Commission to come out with an answer which is vitally important to regions served by smaller airports.
Yeah, well, I can certainly give you the latter assurance. What I meant specifically was if you, within the EU framework, say this route can only, or this set of slots can only be used for domestic passengers, you might then find that you had an airport in another country say, well, in that case, we're going to remove your slots into Frankfurt or into Schiphol because you are preventing us arbitrarily from getting into your airport, because that slot that is free that I would like, I can't have because it's only supposed to be for a domestic, and that's not what you're supposed to do within the EU. That's national discrimination. I'm personally optimistic, although I can't tell you precisely why I'm optimistic, but that if you've got airports that would kind of like to do this at both ends, and that Heathrow and Gatwick, I think, believe that this would be good. I mean, it would be good for their long-term business model, but also that it would be good for the sort of acceptability of the airport and for the impact on the economy as a whole, that we may be able to find some way of doing this. That's what I'm hoping. Gordon Dewar.
Hi, just looking for a clarification of why you support this idea of a subsidised route from Dundee to Stansted. I'll put that in context. Dundee is about 45 minutes to an hour's drive away from Edinburgh Airport, about an hour and a half from Aberdeen. It's a nationalised, loss-making, subsidised airport with now a subsidised route to Stansted at a cost, last time I looked at it, about £250 per passenger journey. And why you think that's in the national interest when we're trying to operate a competitive commercial environment?
The government, this is a government policy rather than mine. This is not something we recommended. But I felt that the government's justification of using a small amount of money to promote routes which would not be viable at the moment, or this is done on a time-limited basis, does seem to be compatible with what a lot of people have said about how people would like to move from an airport that is close to them. Indeed, I believe so. You may have said something similar yourself.
What pressure can you mount with the government? So, and we were all at the AOA the other day, where both the politicians said they would further look into the whole thing when you publish it. What pressure can you put on the government to see that we're not going to go for another 40 years or even 40 months until they actually do something?
Well, I think that the most useful service that the Commission can perform is to produce a report which is as thorough as possible, which examines all the arguments uphill and down Dale, and which therefore cuts off available routes for procrastination. In other words, you can't come along and say, well, we haven't looked at this, you haven't looked at that, so we'll find another reason to delay. I think personally that is the best service that the Commission can perform, rather than trying to engage in a very high-profile political debate. I would note that when politicians don't want to make a decision because it's a bit awkward, that one route is open to them is to set up a commission. But they've done that, and although Richard Leese seemed to argue at one point for a completely different set of a commission, I have to say that's a counsel of despair in my mind. The sort of hunting of the snark of a completely integrated, holistic national infrastructure plan, well, I'm not a candidate for that one. But I think that the best we can do is that. And I'm optimistic because I think that this government tried the policy route of having no policy, and that wasn't a great hit. That the Prime Minister then did find that it wasn't really possible within a coherent economic strategy to say we just don't have a view on airports. We just don't deal with that. I don't think he found that a very comfortable position to be in, and that's why he decided to reopen the question, but for decision in the next Parliament, by asking me to do this job. So I think that a government coming in, of whatever complexion it is, will have to look at a clear recommendation and an alternative, which is, not to have a policy. And that didn't look like a great idea in the past because, the pressure building up for some resolution of this is quite strong. So, I travel hopefully.
But Sir Howard, the fact is that this has hung over the nation for a very long time, even back to the time when we had majority governments. It is not beyond the realms of possibility that we will not have a formal coalition next time. We might have somebody offered confidence and supply. We might have a coalition made up of 3 political parties. It ain't looking good from a purely political point of view for a decision on this. However thorough your recommendation, I'm sure it will be.
Well, hey, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to stand here and say, hey guys, I've been wasting my time for the last 2.5 years? I am going to say that to you, and I would tell you this, you're just a mouthpiece for people's views. Let me tell you this, if people like you who are engaged in this go around saying, whoa, a new government's not going to make a decision, they're all going to be a coalition, they're not going to know what to do, they've looked at this for 40 years, they've never decided before, they're not going to next time, then you will get what you wish for.
That's the Etihad. That's the Etihad fighting spirit.
So let's be cheerful.
Yeah. Okay. I know the lady's waiting over there.
Yeah, we might win in Rome. That's what I'm saying. Another way of putting the same point.
Madam, could you just bear with me because this gentleman has been waiting an awful long time, sir.
Sir Howard, John Strickland. The Commission's commented in a lot of its work so far about the need to look at airline business models that are going to come out in the future. It's acknowledged that 20, 30 years ago we didn't have the Gulf carriers, we couldn't have seen the impact they've had today on the UK market, and low-cost carriers too in the short-haul arena. How do we get through this crystal ball gazing in a more reliable way so that this tricky decision, finally balanced, is indeed the right one in terms of the type of capacity, but it can be put in place and matches the best forecast of what the airline industry will look like in 20 years' time?
Yeah. That is, well, it's a very important point, and that's going to be the most difficult element of our decision, actually. What we are doing is, as you've possibly seen, we've commissioned through the OECD some work on airline business models to look at what the plausible responses might be to the different expansion options. And from this purpose, there are 2 really, because the 2 sub-options at Heathrow don't make much difference from an airline business model point of view. And we've commissioned a second bit of work to try to put some numbers on that, and to try to say, what would the likely airline response be to expansion of Gatwick? I mean, this was discussed earlier on. People asked about whether a hub would move, etc. But to try to see just what kind of response you would get. And also, and this is another dimension of resilience, to Jeff's point really, which is, you want an option which doesn't just bet on one particular route. So that means questions like, is a Heathrow option compatible at all with low cost at Heathrow? Supposing there were more low cost, could the Heathrow option actually accommodate it in the way Schiphol does, in fact, with a separate part of the airport which offers a cheaper service, more flexible service for low cost carriers? Could Gatwick develop a rival hub if that were the way the industry was going? So it's not that I think we can be absolutely certain about how it will go, but we need to choose an option which is constructed in a way that is resilient to different ways in which the market could develop. But that's going to be the hardest bit of it, I think.
Hi, I'm Catherine Ritchie. I'm an undergrad student at the University of Leeds. I was wondering, obviously there will be increased regional traffic from expansion in the southeast and obviously increased regional benefits, but with the increased traffic to London, are the benefits to London going to outweigh the added benefits to the regional economies? And so will London just continue to sort of gallop further away than the regions?
The economic analysis that we have done does not suggest that, and suggests that the economic benefits to the regions would be considerable, and that this would not solely benefit London at all. No, it doesn't. It doesn't support that contention. You can have a look at the regional analysis. There's a economic analysis paper done by PwC, which is published on our site. And are you doing economics? Oh well, you should look at it then, and let us know if you think it's right. But I mean, it actually slightly surprised us in a way, in that it gave quite a high bias to the to regional growth. And we've got a couple of advisors. There's a centre for regional economics, regional spatial economics, which is actually a joint venture between the LSE and Leeds. And the guy who runs that, Henry Overman, who is actually a professor at the LSE, but it's a joint centre, he's on our expert advisory panel. And so he's looked at this and thinks it's okay.
This is an interesting issue, isn't it? Because I think you talked about £100 billion over a long period of time.
Something like that, yeah.
Which is a heck of a lot of money. And yet Sir Richard was talking about ripples and trickles. So it's an interesting area. Remaining questions? Looking around? Mr. Muirhead, perhaps the last question.
It's not too hard a question, I think, Howard. And it's more of an observation as well. I think as an industry, we're all recognising that a runway is necessary. I wonder, when you get challenged about how politicians are going to react to it, whatever decision the Commission makes, I wonder how the industry will react to whatever decision you make. Because if we take the same sort of view that if it's not what we want, we're going to start objecting to it, then the chances are we'll end up with nothing again. So, it's more or less a plea that if we actually, and I worked with the Commission for a year, they do consider all of these issues quite thoroughly. If we want to see additional capacity in this country, we better get behind what the Commission says, whether we like it or not. That would be
on the basis it's the only game in town.
On the basis that putting a runway not where we want is better than having no runway at all. And I think that is quite where I would come from.
Thank you. Well, that is a helpful observation. People will have to be satisfied that it's at least a reasonable response, but I hope we can satisfy them of that. And I agree with you, and I think that in response to John Strickland's point as well, whatever business models are, I mean, London and the UK is a very desirable market for airlines to access. London is the biggest O&D market in the world, and people want to be here. And, if a decision is made for this or that, and it may not be what the airline most wanted, they'll then kind of adjust their business model a bit to cope with that. I'm quite sure they will. So I think that it would be a pity if, whenever we decide on our recommendation, that people then say, well, it should have been that way, should have been that way, because we do know that the politicians would love an opportunity to put this off again, which I hope we can avoid giving them. Thank you for your questions anyway. Thank you.